Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first ever episode of Duffington Talks. This podcast is brand new, and it's sort of aims to serve alongside articles. So, if you don't know me, I'm the website that is Duffington Media. I write articles about current events, about politics, about history, um, about all sorts of things. But the issue with writing articles is that they can be very time consuming. So I am now turning to podcast form. The aim for this podcast is to come out every Monday discussing the events of the previous week, or it will come out on Monday and discuss uh, anything that you guys suggest. So sort of topics, so themes you want me to talk about, topics, anything of interest to you that you want to hear me discuss from the past, or if I don't have any suggestions, I'll just look back on the sort of the media news that I want to talk about from the week before. So we have two topics to talk about today, two main topics. The first one is the Gary Lineker issue situation that I guess has now come full circle as of recording this today, and the second one is Piers Morgan saying that he's a black lesbian, and then I want to give everyone a little rundown on identity and some like sort of summarize some of my findings on that to help everyone explain why you can't just say that, because I think there are certain things with identity that are talked about in like anthropological or scholarly circles, but it hasn't translated yet to the news, which I think is quite interesting, because anyone that sort of reads about a lot of forms of identity academically will understand that the sort of things that Piers Morgan and these right wing commentators like to say about identity have been not debunked, but they've been criticised since the 70s and 80s. But yet none of that has filtered down into the news. So yeah, let's get into it and let's talk about Gary Lineker. So Gary Lineker came under fire from uh, I don't know, a specific wing of people, particularly conservatives, and he also came under fire from the BBC themselves for tweeting about the government's migration bill. And so we'll start off by contextualizing the situation. He tweeted, "This is just an measurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s, and I'm out of order." So we need to start off using word level analysis that you learn in GCSE English. Start off by actually looking at what he's saying, because this is something that has been actually massively overlooked. Now, Gary says in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 1930s. Now, he's not saying that the policy of banning people coming over of small boats is the same as the migration policy of Germany in the 30s. And one of the reasons why he can't say that is because Germany's migration policy in the 1930s wasn't to ban Jews from migrating into Germany, because Jews were already in Germany. It was targeting a minority that was already prominent in the country. What he's saying is that the language, if we look at the specific technique used, it's rhetoric, the rhetoric of political speeches made by Hitler, and now he's saying the Conservative government. The language is not dissimilar. So what he's specifically saying is that the rhetoric used by the government, and to put it frankly, it's the rhetoric of marginalizing a minority group that, I mean, it's done absolutely nothing. The same with the Jews in Germany. The Jews were blamed for losing World War One. They were blamed just for existing in Germany because of rampant anti-Semitism. And what he's saying is that rhetoric of blaming a group for the country's ills is being repeated by the Conservative Party. So now that's outlining the issue that got him into trouble. It was followed by obviously a media storm, but a media storm that, I mean, I've got the tweet here. I've got a screenshot of the tweet, and I've got the tweet from quoted in an article by The Sun, which is quite interesting because if you read a lot of articles quote the tweet but don't then sort of discuss it. And most of the discussion that I saw just around the country focused on comparison between the Nazis and the Conservative government. Now, he's not comparing policy, I mean, as I've just discussed, but the main thing to move on is that there is a difference between specifically saying they are Nazis, which obviously comes with massive connotations, and and calling out rhetoric, because political rhetoric is an issue because it misleads people, truth be told, and so that I think is an issue in itself. And so we look at if you look at how actually Rishi Sunak framed this bill in Parliament, he uses some terminology which is interesting because he describes these people coming over on boats. He says it's unfair on those who come here legally when others come here by cheating the system. Now, as I outlined in one of my first articles, I won't rehash the statistics over and over again, but I will just say if you are granted asylum in this country and you've come over from a small boat, you've not cheated the system, because that's perfectly legal. If this country gives you asylum, no matter how you come to the country, any way that you've come to the country, it was legal from the fact that you were a genuine refugee. So that is rhetoric. It's inciting something that really isn't factually true, because you're not cheating the system if you are a refugee being granted refuge, being granted asylum. So, you know, it's disingenuous. But then this is in a parliamentary speech. He says, above all, it's unfair on the British people who play by the rules when others come here illegally and benefit from breaking the rules. So we have a rhetorical dichotomy between Brits who are here legally, playing by the rules, not doing anything wrong, and illegal non-Brits coming here, breaking the rules. Now, first things first, British culture and identity, very, very complex thing to get into. But again, if you are a refugee, nationality should not come into it. You should not be discriminated upon because of your nationality. So again, they are framing this, they're othering people that are asylum seeking. Very, very, very problematic. This should never happen. The reason why is because you can criticise individuals in this case because the numbers are so small. There's 40,000 people, I think, a year approximately that come over. That's sort of on average, and 10% of those don't get asylum. So we're talking about a vast minority of people. Considering there are we up to 70 million people in the UK now? We're talking about 4,000 people that have broken the rules. This is a year, that is. This is an extreme minority, and so this minority is being scapegoated. I think that we can say that. And so Gary Lineker has analysed, the scapegoating from the government and said that, well, the Germans did exactly the same thing, which is exactly true. The Germans picked on a minority, the Jews. They were easy to pick upon because they couldn't defend themselves, because they were vulnerable. The Jews in Europe. Another article that I sort of touched upon this, but the Jews have been the victim of anti-Semitism in Europe for, probably all of history. The Romans were anti-Semitic towards the Jews, so I think I'd comfortably say there's not been a period in which the Jews have not been victims of anti-Semitism. So again, it's a group that can't defend themselves and that is the victim of political rhetoric that's saying that the country's issues are being caused by Group X. They benefit from breaking those rules. Well, how do they benefit from breaking those rules? Well, apparently they're here committing crimes. They're here, making money and extorting people, and they're benefiting. They're apparently getting above British people, which is really ridiculous. Unfounded statements, unfactually correct. and just problematic in itself. And well, Rishi Sunak goes on to say that the global asylum framework has become obsolete. Basically, he's saying that, well, what we're doing is not wrong because we're just rethinking everything with refugees, and to basically put the icing on the cake for picking on a certain minority. Rishi Sunak makes the fatal error of asylum, of sort of framing how asylum is seen in this country, because he invokes um, free states where we have granted asylum to people, and it is important to mention statistically that we have granted more asylum seekers from these free states than any other country, and I think, doing the mental maths in my head, it would be fair to say than any other country in the last decade. So there are more people from these free states in periods of strife than there were asylum seekers from any from all the other countries combined in the last decade. So he says, and in the last year, we have opened our hearts and homes to people from Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. I know for a fact that the amount of Ukrainians, it would take 3 years of small boat travellers to make up the amount of Ukrainians that have been given refuge, and that's Ukraine alone. So that is an issue in itself. And the reason why it's an issue is because here we have free countries that it's okay to come from to claim asylum. And yes, these are countries that absolutely, people from these countries absolutely need to claim asylum. Hong Kong is being basically victimized by China, it's being bullied into stricter laws. Hong Kong should always be independent from China itself, but China is using bully tactics to make the Hong Kongers subservient. Afghanistan, we all know that in Afghanistan, the UK and US troops finally withdrew, meaning that the Taliban regained control of the state, and all of the people that worked with the administration that was pro UK and US needed to flee, because otherwise they were at risk of being tortured and killed. And Ukraine are currently being invaded by Russia. These three countries need to claim asylum. The people need to claim asylum, and that is perfectly fair. They're fleeing situations of strife. However, these are three massive circumstances of strife that are, I would say, rare, and I would say rare because Ukraine, like Afghanistan, again was caused by us. Hong Kong was caused by China, and Ukraine was caused by Russia. They're all three, big news stories, and I'm not belittling them. I'm just saying it how it is. Rishi Sunak is invoking three big news stories. Look at how good we are. We've taken refugees from Hong Kong, which is a former UK colony, Afghanistan, which we caused the mess in the first place, and Ukraine, well, it's symbolic of Europe coming together against Russia. You couldn't not take refugees from those three countries without being heavily criticised, and especially as a Conservative government where we have to look as the Conservatives like to look like they're being tough against people, so against the Taliban and extremism, against China, protecting the interests of Hong Kong, and, well, Europe against Russia. So these three places are not your average places. It's not like he's saying, oh yeah, well, we've taken in refugees from Yemen, where they've been in a civil war for years, and Syria as well, where they've also been in a civil war for years. These are other war-torn places, but he's never going to say, and Syrians and Yemenis come over on the small boats. They don't know again the statistics, but I know that there have been a wave of Syrians coming over in the small boats, and he essentially says that today far too many of the beneficiaries of that generosity are not those directly fleeing war zones or at risk of persecution. Now, how can you justify being a refugee? Means you're seeking refuge from something, from something that you feel that you need to seek refuge from. It does not mean you have to flee a war, because you can be a refugee. You can be a refugee from climate. If you're fleeing a place where you've lost your home to natural disaster, you are equally as justifiable as a refugee than you are fleeing a war. Again, this is where the othering comes in, and I know this is it's quite broad context, but it's absolutely necessary, because what Gary Lineker is saying in this small tweet is a very, very small summary of all of these issues. And I'm taking this from Rishi Sunak's speech in Parliament. This is the transcript of a parliamentary speech. So this isn't what he's saying in private. This is what he's saying in public. He's saying all this rhetoric. You do not need to flee a war zone to be a refugee. And I will now take that, to summarise this position. He says many originate from fundamentally safe countries. Now, what is a safe country? If I am from the UK, and let's just say, hypothetically, that I live in an area where a certain gang is in control of said area, and I go against said gang, and now the gang want to kill me. Obviously, this is an extreme, but let's just hear me out for the purpose of this situation. Now, if I was to flee from the area where I lived, let's just say, I'm fleeing from England because I move away from England and the gang comes after me, so I flee to somewhere completely different. I flee to another country. Now, if I've moved country, technically I am a refugee. Now, what happens is that because of the financial situation in England and my suspected financial situation from where I've moved from, I do not need to claim asylum, because although there may be a threat on my life, I am in the secure position to go make a new life somewhere else. Now, let's put ourselves in Tirana, the capital of Albania. Now, let's say that there is a criminal gang in Albania that is after us, and we do not have the same finances that someone does fleeing any city in England. We are fleeing maybe for our lives, maybe we got caught up in gang trouble. And again, this is all hypothetical, but this is just showing the rationale of the situation. So we're fleeing this gang, and we've fled to we can't go to Italy because Italy has a large Albanian population, and it is we need to nuance this. You can't go to a country that's right next door because you don't know if that's a safe place to go. We can go to France. We go to France, and from France we go to England over the channel in a small boat. Now, we have deemed ourselves safe because we're putting distance between Albania and ourselves, and so we've crossed the channel, and now we're claiming asylum, and we're one of the, I think it's 52% of Albanians that get asylum. We've not fled a war. We've not technically fled persecution, governmental persecution, but we've certainly fled something. So 52% of Albanians that flee, and this is just because Albania is one of those places that is deemed a fundamentally safe country. Now, 52% of these Albanians, which I think statistically is, again, it's about 4,000 people, get asylum, because they could be in a position such as that, where they're fleeing someone, they're fleeing a gang. You don't have to be fleeing a war zone or being persecuted by a government to be an asylum seeker. If everyone in, let's just say you live in a village and everyone in that village wants you dead, and you flee and you run and you run and you run, and you're fleeing something genuine that scares you enough to run, you are a refugee. If you're granted asylum, you're a refugee. It's as simple as that. That's the rule. Now, you can say the rule is obsolete, which is what Rishi Sunak tries to do, but that's not good enough, because you apply no nuance. So Rishi Sunak says the law is out of date, but the law is out of date to him because he believes that you're only a refugee if you're directly fleeing war zones or at risk of persecution. That is absolute, it's rhetoric. There's no stats to back that up, as we've seen, and it's just making a minority group where 90% of them are given asylum in this country absolutely no cause to be vilified, and they're defensiveless. Not all of them are defensiveless, but if not all of the people coming over on the boats are defensiveless, because some of them are clearly not granted asylum, but 90% of them and also 90% of them are not granted asylum solely in this country. I think it goes to about half are granted asylum in this country, half are granted asylum on third country grounds, which means that they should have claimed asylum or somewhere else, or they have family members with asylum in another country, so they're sent somewhere else. But it's 90% of the people are genuine refugees, is the main premise. So you're vilifying a group of people when the majority of those people are actually refugees. Regardless of what Rishi Sunak thinks the definition of refugee is, that's not the definition. You can't go around saying that that is, because it's simply not the case. And I think the cherry on top of the icing, if Rishi Sunak's comments were the icing, the cherry on top is now returning back to Gary Lineker after all of the things we've just outlined. So we've just basically looked at Rishi Sunak, what he's saying himself, and I think that it's worth just sticking with what the Prime Minister is saying in Parliament, because if he's saying it in Parliament, the governmental body, Rishi Sunak is obviously Prime Minister, and Gary Lineker is talking about the government and rhetoric. This is in a parliamentary speech. We've, putting it all together, we look at a poll by YouGov, and the poll by YouGov is worded like this: should BBC Sports correspondents be allowed to publicly express their political views on social media? Now, the majority of the country polled, 46%, said they should be allowed to. 21% were unsure, and 33% said should not. Now, then YouGov broke this down by political party. 63% of Labour voters said they should be allowed to, 19% said unsure, and 18% said no, and only 33% of Conservative voters said they should, 12% were unsure, and 55% of Conservative voters said they should not be allowed to express their political views on social media. So what does this really boil down to? It boils down to politics. We've just seen here, this is an overtly political thing according to these people, and the Conservative voters are the people saying that free speech should be accepted in society. We've got Rees Mogg. I know for a fact that Rees Mogg has said multiple times that free speech is a threat in this country, and it needs to be returned by the Conservatives. Well, the majority of Conservatives are saying that Gary Lineker shouldn't be allowed free speech. And the most important fundamental thing, if you believe in free speech, is that Gary Lineker has not said this on the BBC, and he's also not said it using any other account other than his own personal account. So these words are not associated with anyone. It's not like he's using a BBC platform to say it. Gary Lineker is a celebrity in his own right. He's a former professional footballer. He has followings beyond. He's not just a BBC broadcaster. He is a personality in his own right, and he's using his own account, his private account, to say these words. So he's basically using his right of free speech to push his message, which he's allowed to do if you believe in free speech. And to sort of fan the flames, as it were, Piers Morgan, who often vehemently disagrees with Gary Lineker, came out and said that I will defend Gary Lineker, because Piers Morgan, as problematic as you may think he is, and we'll get into that in a little bit, Piers Morgan is a vehement defender of free speech. And credit where credit's due, Piers Morgan, as problematic as he is, seems to actually understand what free speech means. The Conservatives double down on saying, well, you can have free speech, but only when it's against us. When you criticise us, you shouldn't be saying your political views on social media. So, okay, we can see that politically, and if we leave it there, that would be fine. However, we can't just leave it there, because just leaving it there would be a complete disservice to this situation, as the BBC suspended Gary Lineker, and it was because of his political views on social media. He was suspended from Match of the Day. So, well, you'd think, okay, this is policy, this is fair, this is what they outline. You shouldn't be doing this on social media. However, and this is I remember this happening because I was studying politics at the time at school. However, what is ridiculous about the situation is that if the BBC were fairly stopping people from expressing what I can only define from Gary Lineker as an educated opinion, because Gary Lineker is, he's well read in this situation. He knows what he's talking about. He's not just made that up out of thin air. As we've analysed, that there is rhetoric being used here. It's whether you think the rhetoric is influential or problematic is a matter of opinion. But the world is built by opinions, and so Gary Lineker is expressing his. But we have a more problematic case. We have the BBC political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, who made a report on Jeremy Corbyn in 2017, early 2017, on his shoot to kill policy in the aftermath of the Paris attacks, the horrible the terrorist attacks in 2015, and the regulator that reviewed this case, the Kuenssberg, made a report in November 2015, and Kuenssberg essentially lied in the report. She breached impartiality, and she essentially got something factually incorrect, and she was reporting on Labour. Labour. I don't think he was leader then, or he may have just become leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And so Laura Kuenssberg, following the same situation, if you want to re-review the case that the BBC, you can't say that on social media. Well, the BBC political editor directly misled the country in a report, in a news report. So Laura Kuenssberg is still in her job. She still works at the BBC, and to put it as a like-for-like case, Laura Kuenssberg used her platform at the BBC to lie. Gary Lineker used his private platform to give an opinion. So what do we make of that? Well, you can't just say, oh well, Gary Lineker should have been made to step down because he broke the rules, because Laura Kuenssberg broke the rules. What's different about these two people? Well, you could say that it's the party is different. You could say that Laura Kuenssberg was attacking Labour and Gary Lineker was attacking the Conservatives, and the BBC has a massive left-wing bias. Now, I don't think that's genuine and fair to say. The BBC has problems with the government currently, and what I mean by that is that the BBC doesn't know where to stand on what the current government is currently doing, and I think that's an issue in itself. But if you do a lot of reading on the BBC from right-wingers, you will know that the right-wingers equally hate the BBC, because the BBC often paints them in a bad light. It describes people as far right, so on and so forth. So the BBC is not, this. I think it would be disingenuous to say that the BBC is this right-wing tool. People on the far right and people on the far left typically equally hate the BBC, and the BBC aims to be in the centre. Obviously, that doesn't mean the BBC always gets it right, because the BBC should also be reflecting and influencing the public for the public's benefit, not for the benefit of the government. Whereas I think in this case it's sided with a government over the majority of the people, and I think that personally the BBC should be aiming to reflect opinions of people. So it should give both sides of the story, and it should have conducted an inquest before jumping to a decision, because you make an inquest before you jump to a decision. The main difference between Laura Kuenssberg and Gary Lineker is that Laura Kuenssberg is someone inherently involved in politics. Now, we've had multiple times, there are loads of occasions of people at the BBC, people involved in politics, airing opinions for and against the government on many BBC-led programmes, and that's not a problem. Obviously, again, it's, they're not using their platform because they're invited on there, but they're specifically political people. Laura Kuenssberg is the political editor. She's allowed to get involved in politics because she's the political editor. I think we have to say that the main issue here is that Gary Lineker is at risk of oversimplifying the situation, Gary Lineker is not anyone political. And if you follow Gary Lineker on Twitter, you know he is very political, but he's not involved in the world of politics, according to the BBC. So it sort of feels to me as if this is a stay in your lane situation. Now, I'm sure if Laura Kuenssberg went out and tweeted something from her account that was political and attacked someone political, that wouldn't be breaching any rules because she is in the political sphere. And I'm saying this hypothetically, but I think it's important to note that she falsified a political report and is still in a job. Gary Lineker says an opinion which is not factually incorrect, it's an opinion, it's subjective, and gets asked to step down. This is fundamentally, to me, a stay in your lane situation. Gary Lineker is not in the world of politics, so he shouldn't be piping up and talking. He should be, staying where he is. And I think we can see this also in the Conservative reaction. You have to remember, football is more of a working class sport. I'd say comfortably that most footballers come from working class backgrounds. I think Gary Lineker himself is the son of a butcher or a greengrocer or something like that. My apologies for not knowing particularly off the top of my head, but I think Gary Lineker, himself is from a working class background, and so this is a sort of, and the Conservatives, they jumped at this. Conservative people said, "Oh yeah, this is what match of the day should be, just showing the football. None of that waffle, none of that chit chat." And I'm thinking the analysis given by the pundits on BBC is extremely interesting. You don't always agree with it. That's football. You don't always agree with decisions, but it is interesting nonetheless to hear what these experts of the game, normally, Alan Shearer, Ian Wright, Gary Lineker, three ex-professional footballers, have to say about the current situation. And you've got these Conservatives who probably never watch Match of the Day saying, "Oh wow, this is much better. This is great." And it just seems like it's an ultimate stay in your lane. They don't want these people to talk because Gary Lineker represents a group of people that ultimately already don't like the government. So he's not saying anything. He's not saying anything that is new. People have been criticising the rhetoric of this government, and particularly around migrants, for a long time. It's not rare to see even. But it's the fact that Gary Lineker has a platform to do this that then causes a problem. So I think, and this is the thing we see with the backlash as well, is that all of the sort of sports podcasts and call-in centres, TalkSport, I think one of the ones that I've seen, I think every call on TalkSport following this was supporting Gary Lineker. And I think that it is, I don't want to put it down solely to class because it's also what party you support, but it definitely seems like a snooty. Oh well, he's not in politics. He's not in the right class. Why can he say the things he says? And I mean, not only is that fundamentally wrong, but also it is a pure suppression of free speech. Because if you say, well, Gary Lineker, you're not allowed to separate your politics from your work, which everyone should be able to do. I think that the fact that Gary Lineker doesn't go on Match of the Day and start ranting about the government. One of the most political he's ever been in a program is the start of the Qatar World Cup, when he had a monologue criticising the fact that the World Cup was in Qatar. That's overtly political, but again, it's the right political because everyone in the country wanted to be seen criticising Qatar, despite the fact that we were all watching the World Cup and engaging with something that it already happened. Fundamentally, it already been decided. We didn't boycott it, but we wanted to be seen criticising it. So that's the most political Gary Lineker has been on broadcast. And he can separate his politics from presenting football. He doesn't make a political comment when he's watching a game of football because you don't need to mix and match politics and your work, especially in the case of Gary Lineker. He can do that. Nothing that he said on Twitter impacts how he is when he's presenting Match of the Day. So moving him away, he's been reinstated now, makes no sense. He's not a threat. He's not using anything other than his own personal position to pass these comments. And as we've seen, the comments are not completely unjustified. And also, the majority of the people in the country agree with the fact that Gary Lineker should be able to say what he said. Not that they all agree with him. So that's the situation we've got ourselves in. Now, at this time, Monday, the 13th, he's been reinstated, and rightly so. BBC saw the backlash. They aired Match of the Day without anyone. I think the commentators even boycotted. They just aired it with football, and that's the situation at the result of making a rash decision. A couple of takeaways from this. Firstly, I think that the BBC at the moment are in a situation where they are in a pickle. They don't know how to act with a government. Government popularity is it's the long and the short is that government popularity is unknown. We don't know really how people perceive things. For example, a lot of the polls say that, I don't know, it's about 55% of the country agree with returning people on small boats to other countries. However, 16% of the country believe it's an important issue. So we have statistics that are essentially oxymoronic. They disagree with each other. So people would happily see them be sent back, but don't care about it. The majority of the country doesn't care about it at the moment because we're in a cost of living crisis. We have ridiculous energy bills. People care about other things, and the government are pushing this because the Conservatives want to make no fundamental changes to society because they don't believe in putting money into the government. They don't believe in that. They believe in austerity. Their economic policy is completely not set up for this situation, so that they're pushing this line of the people coming over in small boats, which the majority of the country obviously has an opinion on because it's being talked about so prominently. However, they don't believe it's an important issue. So BBC don't know where to sit on this, and they make a statement. They make the wrong decision. They anger everyone because I think most people, even if you're in the working class and you're sort of one of the people that watches people like Nigel Farage, they probably have a better conceptualization of free speech because they believe fundamentally that they're being suppressed than people like Nigel Farage and then people that would push the free speech message, because they are obviously, by the fact that they're pushing the free speech message and they're celebrities with quotes, they don't actually believe in free speech. The people at the bottom that are following these people, the sort of the backbone of these people's supporters, probably have a better understanding of free speech, as we've seen, because the Conservatives that came out to attack Gary Lineker were middle class. They were of a certain position where they used their power, their position to come out and publicly try and influence people against Gary Lineker. Well, that's not going to work because this is where the divide happens. So that's the first issue. The BBC don't know where they sit. The second issue is that we've seen other people like Laura Kuenssberg make a greater mistake, lie, and so it's a tricky situation. Obviously, this all came out. I remember it happening at the time, as in I remember the report come back from Laura Kuenssberg, but this is, it's an ongoing issue with neutrality at the BBC. What classes as neutrality and when does it class as neutrality? I would personally believe that when you say something on your own private platform, like not private platform, private profile like Twitter, it's clearly coming from you and you're not using any other platform other than Twitter to say it. So there's no association with the BBC. However, if Gary Lineker's Twitter account was Gary Lineker at the BBC and he was tweeting this again, the BBC are sort of linked into this. The BBC have no affiliation with Gary Lineker's Twitter account. So how does that compromise his role as a neutral on BBC? It doesn't, because if you want to kid yourself into believing that everyone that talks on the BBC is neutral, well, that's a lie. No one's neutral on the BBC. However, they're neutral when they do their talking on the BBC. That's the purpose of neutrality. People have opinions. Everyone has an opinion, whether they believe they're apolitical. They're going to have some inherent opinion that is the factor of something. It might not be a political opinion, but you may have a social opinion. So to believe that all of these BBC reporters are, brainless people with no opinion is fact. You can't believe that. But what you can believe is that they have the professionalism and the skill as journalists to state an opinion, and that is the to not state an opinion even, and that is the fundamental skill of being a journalist. And that's what happens when you have a lot of influence and respect in what you do, is that you know when and where to say your opinion. I think that Gary Lineker has showed that, as with a lot of BBC people. They know when to say their opinion and when not to say their opinion. They don't say it on air because the BBC remains neutral, and that is fundamentally what Gary Lineker has done. And so any decision regarding Gary Lineker to remove him because he's not shown neutrality cannot be justified, as we have seen. And I mean, this goes into even slightly further, just to touch upon this, a slightly further problematic thing is that one of David Attenborough's new documentary episodes, where he talked about the impact of climate, was moved to iPlayer only because it's not going to air on TV, or it wasn't aired on TV because they didn't want to seem to be attacking the people that don't believe in climate change, I guess. But then again, you're not neutral by. This is a nature documentary made by, obviously, David Attenborough is the presenter, but the research is done by hundreds of people that make these documentaries. It's not just one man. This is what they're showing is a consensus. Again, if you want to make a program that tackles this consensus, do that. The reason why the people don't make programs tackling the consensus is because the people that are tackling the consensus are on new media. They're not journalistic figures. So again, the BBC are showing neutrality, but they're not showing another side of the opinion. They're just taking the debate out altogether. If you're not debating on something, you're not neutral. You're just ignorant. And so perhaps another element of that there is it's not neutrality but ignorance. That could be a situation that we could ascribe to the BBC. So to move on to a slightly smaller talking point, but an important one nonetheless, is that Piers Morgan on International Women's Day said, "Why can't I, on International Women's Day, say I'm Piers Morgan, I identify as a black lesbian?" Now, obviously, Piers Morgan is being, provocative in what he's saying. However, this and Piers Morgan is, I would say he's well read. This fundamentally underlines an issue with identity that is never discussed in the political circles. You have this with people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson in America, Piers Morgan prominently in the UK on identity. And one thing that, I don't know if it's they're taking just a psychological approach, but let's just have a little time to talk about anthropology and identity. So essentially, how identity works is that identity is discourse, and what I mean by that is identity is the navigation of people interacting with each other. So identity isn't it's not factual, it's subjective. Every identity is subjective. However, where identity uses objectivity is it uses things that are objectively seen to formulate a subjective identity. And let's give an example. Let's start with one of the most controversial and now pretty much not used ones. Let's have race. Now, white people, you can be objectively white because you can view the color of someone's skin, but the actual racial identity of a white person is not objective. And the reason why it's not objective is because, well, firstly, you can be albino, and you can look white, but that's the result of a genetic mutation. Now, in racial theory, and this is why racial identity is not fact, because racial theory would say that although they look white, they are not white because they don't come from Europe. Because racial theory is influenced by something that is subjective. It is not based on objectivity. And the second issue with racial theory in terms of objectivity is mixed race. If you happen to be mixed race, um, again, you may look more one race than the other, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be just inherently accepted as one race. And we'll look at this. You can look at this for someone that is mixed race, black and white. They may be accepted by neither group. They may be pushed away by either group. They may look more black or more white, darker or lighter, but it's not an objective, it is a subjective. It is navigation of discourse. Now, while this may seem very off the beat and track from what Piers Morgan is saying, it is not, because this is something that was anthropologically talked about in terms of ethnicity, which is sort of moving on from race in the 70s, and it is linked because essentially what we're saying is all identity functions in the same way. So identity, people in the 40s and previously perceived, and I mean people still to this day, perceived race as a factual, scientific category, but race is really dependent on European theory of race and also of categorization that has a whole bunch of other underlying themes, such as geography, because again, white people from Europe are more white than white people from other places, and also purity. It doesn't matter, it's not just what you look, it's how pure you are. And how can you judge purity on looking at someone? Well, you can't. That's a subjective, it's not an objective. So these things are made to look objective when they're not. No identity is objective. They use subjectivity and objectivity together. Objectivity is often used as the defining categories of identity, but identity itself is subjective because you can change those categories. And to sort of supplant this theory to gender identity. Now, to say that gender is scientific, you can say that if you want. That's factually incorrect. People have been saying that sex is scientific. We'll roll with that for now, as that's more consensus than anything else. So we'll say that sex is science and gender is an expression. So sex is the objective thing that you're basing yourself off in some cases, and that's what Piers Morgan looks to do. Obviously, the first thing in identity is that if you're saying that you can't be transgender, a lot of the argument is that you're still a man, you're still a woman. That's not separating sex and gender, and that's using a subjective that's using what they believe is objectives to create a subjective argument. Now, what Piers Morgan is doing is he's being provocative, and he's saying, I identify as a black lesbian. Now, for identity to work, identity has to be the result of discourse. It has to be accepted as well as invoked. And so what we mean by that is identity. When you invoke an identity, the invoked identity that Piers Morgan is saying is that he's invoking the identity of being black and the identity of being a lesbian, which is confusing in itself. Does that mean he's saying he's a woman? I'm presuming so. So he's invoking that identity. Now, to hold that identity, there has to be the result of the discourse to have that identity hold. And again, this identity can hold in minority positions. But to have the identity hold, it has to be accepted by a societal discourse or a discourse of a subgroup. But that subgroup will then accept the identity, and the identity will be only subjective only in that subgroup. And so we've seen this with people that don't accept transgender people. Their discourse on identity is subjective because it's based on, perceived objectives, even then it's tricky to say it's based on perceived objectives, because pretty much everything, when it boils down to that, is now it's all become so subjective, and the only objective thing that they're basing it on is what they're seeing. And I guess even then that's a subjective, because it's what you take from that. So it gets very, very, very complex. So Piers Morgan can say that he is a black lesbian, but he has to be, it has to be, in it. He puts it in a discourse, and the discourse has to come back as saying, okay, well, what are you, what traits are you forming that make your identity? So what traits does Piers Morgan have that conforms to the identity he is invoking? Well, none, because he's being, deliberately provocative. But this works for every identity. You can be deliberately provocative in any identity, and that's not a problem. But the one thing you have to do is you have to think that identity is a navigation. If I say I'm English, what am I saying when I'm English? What traits mean English to me? Does it mean I'm from the British Isles, and then more specifically from the boundary of the country of England? To some people, being English still means being white. Would you say that being English is an objective category? Well, are you nationally English, culturally English? You could be English born abroad. Does that still make you English? Identity is not simple. There is no such thing as objective identity. Because identity is the navigation of how humans interact with each other. We have made identity because we make identity what is important, and the important identities at the moment, nationality still seems to be quite important. Gender identity and sexual identity still seem to be quite important, and so they are made to be more important. Now, let's pick on something that seems to be rather unimportant at the moment. Let's go for local identity. What town or city do you come from? That who cares about local identity, except maybe in the sort of underlying guise of what football team do you support, for example. That sort of low level tribalism. Why is what town and city you come from not important? Well, because the discourse on identity at the moment puts other things above it, and that's just how identity works. Once upon a time, maybe it mattered where you came from. I mean, it still does to some people, but at the moment, in the current discourses on identity, people don't really care about that. It's not an issue. And identity is fluid. It's changing all the time. What I mean by that is what becomes important changes all the time. And so when Piers Morgan makes his statement, he's incorrect, but he's incorrect because he doesn't seem to understand how identity works. You can't just say something. You need a proviso of what the identity is actually means. So this is something that is incredibly complex, but also incredibly subjective at the moment. Is you have the Americans Daily Wire people basically asking the question of what it means to be a woman, and they've like, oh, got you, because no one can answer. Well, no one can answer that without bearing into subjectivity, because if you're someone that is against people transitioning and against people changing their gender, one of your categories for being a woman, in gender and in sex, will be their chromosomes. And so that is putting, you objectively have chromosomes. Here's where the objective sort of comes into it again. It's a very tricky path, but they have something objective that defines their subjective definition of a woman. And this is why you can't play got you with identity, because I can just as easily say, well, that doesn't fit into my definition of a female gender, because I don't believe it's important. No one is right or wrong in that case, because the whole discourse of identity is what subjective do you manufacture the identity to be using an objective. So I say that do sexual organs affect gender? The same thing as, does the color of your skin affect whether you're black or white? Now, obviously, things are more more agreed upon than others. Someone that had surgery, I remember seeing this a couple of years ago, to make themselves Korean because they wanted to sort of change the color of their skin and their features to look Korean. The same way as that if you, I don't know, spray tan yourself much darker to basically appear black, does that make you black? Now that's veering probably on racist because you think that being black is just a matter of the color of your skin, whereas being black also comes with all of the things that come as a result of having that skin color, because also your identity is formed by loads of other factors that navigate each other. So you're not just black because, and this is where we talk about local area, you're not just black, but you may be black from a certain area. That means your identity is shaped by multiple things, because if you're black in a majority white area, you're going to have a different experience to being black in a majority black area. That's identity. Your local area comes into it, and this is where the navigation and where sort of the self-realization of identity comes into. Incredibly complex. It's not easy. So we need to understand that identity is a navigated discourse, and we need to stop, um, making provocative statements like "I'm a black lesbian," because if you don't understand what categories it's often framed as, what dimensions of the identity you're dealing with, then you don't understand identity at all. And the fact that so many of these people don't seem to understand how identity works, and anthropologists have been saying this since the 70s, it is really incredible, because I think that there is so much complexity towards identity that the sort of current culture war, political side of things don't want to pick up upon, because it negates every argument. Every argument in the culture war, both sides of the argument, is negated, because you can't argue on a factual plane, on a political plane, about the differences between two identities that are inherently subjectively created. And that's, I guess, why neither side wants to bring it into the argument, because it nullifies the whole point of having the argument in the first place. And once that starts seeping into society, however long it takes, people will be looking back on what's going on currently and thinking, wow, this is really what they spent their time doing, arguing over something that had, when people start writing books about how the culture war panned out, if anyone reads any anthropological essay that, a lot of it sort of focuses on ethnicity, but then gets sort of transferred from the 70s and 80s. If you read those anthropological essays and you look back, you must be thinking, wow, these things, 50 years ago, these people were saying things that basically contradicted the whole argument that is being built upon in the culture war. But yet, and it was well known, because these theories are still being navigated today in scholarship, but people are just not talking about them. Why that is the case, if you want me to talk about my schema for identity in another episode, more than happy to do so. But yeah, it's very important to remember, identity is a navigation. It's not objective. And so I hope you really enjoyed the first episode of Duffington Talks. Two topics to whet the appetite. As always, leave a like on whatever podcast thing this comes out on. This will also definitely be on YouTube, so you can leave a like on there. Comment on YouTube. Definitely going to be on YouTube, so comment on there to if you want to see something next. If you want to have a debate about either of the topics we've talked about today, leave a comment. This will also be on the website, just because it's more permanent on the website. I really hope you guys enjoyed. I really value any feedback, any constructive criticism. Makes my day. So yeah, just guys, get involved also in the comments. I hope to see you around soon, and I hope to see you next week. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll check you guys later.